So welcome to Speaking the Predicament, part of Friends of the Earth's Learning Hub for 2022. This is an ongoing series to help engage our members and to collaborate with other educators to look at various global justice themes as well. So we're going to be exploring activism, the arts. Later on in the series, we'll also be exploring energy poverty, climate anxiety, and more topics through shared discussions, listenings, readings, and watchings as well. So for tonight's session on Speaking the Predicament, we're really delighted to be working with Hannah Bingle-Jones and Katrina Nigul, who are doing amazing work at the Department of German School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at University College Cork. Tonight we'll be hearing poetry readings from poet Seán Hewitt, so thank you for joining, and a presentation on graphic storytelling from activist Alex Wernke. I really look forward to hearing all the ideas and insights from the attendees this evening, so please do use the chat function throughout. Now, I'll also be asking a few questions at the end of the session, but I'd like to start our session this evening with a quick poll, if that's okay, which I know doesn't work very well on everyone's screens, but I'm going to launch a question to all of you. Is this your first Friends of the Earth Learning Hub? And there's three possible answers. No, yes, this is my first Learning Hub, or yes, this is my first Friends of the Earth event ever. Now, I know that if you're on your phone or another device, the polls don't work very well. So I am also going to put a link in the chat to our feedback form, and that has the same questions in it. So if you just let me know in the chat or in the poll there, if this is your first Friends of the Earth Learning Hub, or if you were at the last one or a previous one. So let's see, it's looking pretty even at the moment. We have 40-something% have never been to one of our learning hubs before. I'm just going to end the poll in one moment now. Okay, so it's even enough. It's 45% haven't been to a learning hub before, 32% have, and 23% of you, this is your first Friends of the Earth event ever. So thanks very much for joining, whether you've been here before or not. Now I'm just going to ask that you share your feedback at the end of this session as well. I will be sharing that form again, which has a few other questions in it which help us improve. And I'm going to pass over to Katrina and Hannah from UCC now to kick off this session of Speaking the Predicament and to tell us more about tonight's programme. So thank you very much to Hannah and Katrina.
Thanks very much, Evelyn. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good evening and welcome to this evening. We're delighted to have you here, and we're delighted to introduce our two special guests for this evening. And in a moment, I'm going to be handing over to Hannah Bingle-Jones, my colleague on the project. So I'm just going to say a few words of introduction about the project. I see, and it's lovely to see people coming back who were here with us 2 weeks ago when we had the first of these two sessions on Speaking the Predicament. And at that point, I talked a little bit about why we chose the term predicament for the kind of work we want to do here, which has its home in our department, the Department of German in UCC, and in the kind of work we do around analysing literature, film, poetry, the arts and culture, and thinking about the sorts of work these things can do as we grapple with ecological breakdowns of various kinds, as we grapple with the emotions and anxieties that can come with these, and as we try to make a holding space to think forward together, where our emotions might not be in the way, they might actually be an interesting kind of energy that we can begin to use and channel. So how can literature, the arts, film, poetry, graphic art empower us? We know they can inspire us. We know they can help us to pause for reflection, but how can they empower the kind of work we want to do as well in terms of action and activism? So these are some of the questions we're exploring on our project. And one of the reasons it was very important to us, not just because by trade we deal with the German-speaking world in our work, that's part of what we do, that's our education, if you like, and we teach students the German language and we teach them about German culture because of where we're located. But in a way, that's kind of a coincidence. What we wanted to bring to life this evening is the fact that the issues of a planetary nature, global, ecological, environmental issues, issues around sustainability, around climate justice, climate breakdown, ecological destabilization, these, of course, affect everybody, no matter where you are, what culture you belong to, what language you speak. And yet they carry within them that strange paradox of forcing us to think at the planetary level and yet be more deeply rooted than ever before in where we are. And that could be anywhere. And so we want to explore some instances of how language and visual art can help with that rooting process, can help to bring us back to earth or down to earth, in the words of the French philosopher Bruno Latour. So what is then, in this age of ecological anxiety, the relationship, or the best relationship, between the planetary and the local, between the languages we speak every day and the large unfolding and precarious web of life of which we form a part and which we try to visualize through our art? So these are the sorts of predicaments we're grappling with on the project, and we're really delighted to be able to explore them with you. One of the things that happened 2 weeks ago, and we really didn't know what was going to happen 2 weeks ago in the first of these two events, was that there was an extraordinary level of emotional openness and honesty among the participants, and we've been reflecting on that ever since, and it's going to be informing our next steps with this research. So we really appreciate those of you who participated in that. If you weren't here with us 2 weeks ago, you now have an opportunity to step into that space, and everybody does it in their own way. You might not say a word this evening, that's absolutely fine with us, but we're inviting you to just sit with us, join us, and create that holding space where we can begin to think about these things together and to think about how language and images can empower that collective process, which can be transformational. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Hannah Bingle-Jones, who's the postdoctoral researcher working on the project, and she will introduce our guests for this evening, first of which will be Seán Hewitt. So Hannah, over to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Katrina. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today. And before introducing poet Seán Hewitt, I would like to first give a quick overview of the session today, as we have a full program. And Katrina is so kind to share the PowerPoint with us. So we will be starting with a reading from Seán's debut collection, Tongues of Fire. And after the reading, we will break up into groups where we can talk about the poetry and share our thoughts. We will then come back together again and have the chance to speak with Seán. Then Alex Wernke from Klimakollektiv will give us an insight into their work with graphic-based storytelling and how this relates to resource extraction in the Rhineland region. And we will also have the chance to discuss this project and ask Alex questions. To finish up this Speaking the Predicament series today, we will have a broader discussion about art and action, in what way eco-critical art can make a difference. Please don't forget to use the chat for any questions or comments, and to make it easier for us to monitor the chat, please start your entry with question for Seán, question for Alex, or simply comment. Now I have the honor to introduce our first guest speaker, poet Seán Hewitt. It's a great pleasure for us to welcome you, Seán, today. Seán Hewitt was born in 1990. He is a poet, a book critic for the Irish Times, and he also teaches modern British and Irish literature at Trinity College Dublin. His debut collection, Tongues of Fire, was published in 2020. And it has been awarded numerous prizes, among them the Laurel Prize, which is given for poetry that helps to develop critical discourse around environmental concerns. And the ecological dimension of his poetry was already acknowledged before Tongues of Fire was published. In 2017, Seán received the Resurgent Prize, which is now called the Ginkgo Prize, which is a major international eco-poetic award, which, like the Laurel Prize, promotes works that create new senses for nature and foster environmental awareness. Seán received the Ginkgo Prize for the poem Ilex, which he will be reading today. He has also written an academic book, J.M. Synge, Nature, Politics, Modernism, And he has a new publication coming out, his memoir, All Down Darkness White, which is due to be published this summer. So a warm congratulations, Seán. Today he will be reading from his poetry collection, Tongues of Fire, a collection that has received considerable attention from literary critiques. The Guardian called it a collection of exquisite lyrics, poems that read most often as spells, prayers and incantations, paying an almost religious attention to the natural world. On reading these poems, I was struck by their astounding lyrical quality. I felt a dignified atmosphere. It was as if someone had asked me to enter an intimate conversation. Nature is present throughout the poems, detailed observation intertwined with meditative reflections on grief, sexuality, and relationships. In some poems, memory takes the speaker back into a distant past. I was struck by beautiful metaphors in which layers of meaning shift over one another, touching upon the spiritual. In the poem Leaf, the woods are forms of grief, and each tree described as an altar to time. The speaker is often present, but what some of the poems also made me think about is how the eye holds back, watches, and lets nature reveal itself in its own strangeness. And that reminds me of Rainer Maria Rilke's poetry, as do the smooth transitions between the physical world and what transcends the visible. One of the things that I found especially relevant to the Speaking the Predicament project is how Seán's poetry creates deep trust in the power of language to reveal the dignity of nature. However, there is also something unsettling under the surface of the texts, a subtle hidden fear and a sense of human alienation from the non-human world. Reading the poems feels like walking on frail ice, and we are left with many questions. The poems don't give answers, they make us wonder. There is a sentence by Albert Camus I would like to quote before I hand over to Seán, as I think it catches something of the essence of his poetry. Thinking is learning all over again how to see, directing one's conscience, making of every image a privileged place. Seán, it's a great honor to have you speak here today.
Thank you very much. Will I go ahead?
Please
Great.
do.
I wonder, would you like me to share the poems, Katrina, Hannah? On the screen, I mean.
We were wondering about that, Seán, because, you know, one of the things we're exploring here as well is the appeal through different senses. So might it be an idea to kind of hear the oral delivery first, and then when we're discussing the poems, if you can share them at that point?
Yeah, of course.
Would that be okay?
Yeah. Whatever.
So people can close their eyes.
Well, thank you very much. That was a really generous introduction. It's really lovely to be here. I think I've chosen to read 4 poems today that kind of touch on different aspects of the richness of what Hannah described there. Thank you. The first one has this stitching of vulnerability and I suppose it's one of the few poems in this book where the ending really surprised me, as in I didn't have an ending for this poem for the longest time, and then it just emerged, and it seemed to be a good poem to start with. It's called Evening Poem. First, the clatter iron blackbird, its fanatical shuddering in the magnolia. Dusk, and the garden is reassembling, calling its sparrows home. And what a voice racket under the aucuba, doors closing too, and each sparrow an iron filing sweeping the field lines of the garden. I sit out in the last warmth and watch it all come to rest, the light falling, the thrushes settling in the sycamores at the far end of the lawn, how each tree lowers itself under a new weight. And I hold out for a while, for everything to darken, for the birds to stop singing, as though I am teaching myself again to bear it. Tongues of Fire has a number of longer poems in it, many of which try to recenter or to include queer sexualities into the tradition of the nature poem. This wasn't particularly a conscious decision on my part. I had grown up reading a lot of lyric nature poetry in the tradition of Heaney and writers like that. And then I had a sort of poetic awakening, which came from reading American queer writers who I discovered when I was in my early 20s. And I think Tongues of Fire could probably be best seen as a melding of those two traditions, a tradition of the poetry of the body and the poetry of what occurs beyond the body, the natural, more than human world. So this poem is called Dryad. You'll know that a dryad is a sort of tree spirit. My research in animism comes through. It's quite a long one, so I hope you'll bear with me. Dryad. I remember her covered in snow, in a field where each dead stalk of wildflower was thick with frost. The sky was pink in the hawthorns. The day held on the light edge of breaking. A woman carved from the bole of an oak, her feet, if she had any, buried in the winter's shedding weight. Whoever had turned her from the tree had given her an orb, which she held in both hands, close to the gentle curve of her face. And she stood there, by the half-rotten stile off Broad Lane, head bowed, as though waiting to greet us and offer the frozen circumference of a new world. Years ago, our school had planted the woods behind her, when I was 8 or 9, and now each tree ages alongside us. Every time I go back, I see a part of my life laid out, still growing in a field by the old village. And I used to come here often, at 18 or so, with men at night, and it was strange to pass her as we stumbled in the undergrowth and into the woods, like deer plummeting through the wet branches. And I think now of all the men forced outside after clearing out, into the dark spaces of towns, how they walk in vigil to woodlands and old estates, to the smell of the day settling. Once I came here with a man whose whole body was muscled, as though he too had been carved from a single trunk of wood. I pretended all the time to be a man like him, answering each lie in a deep, alien voice. I think I was afraid he would kill me, and walked a few steps ahead, hearing him moving through the sodden grass, pulling his feet from the bramble vines. We passed the woman without comment, though she stood there in her cloak of wood, the globe held in the lathed green of her hands. Here was so unlike the places other people went, a place without doors or walls or rooms. The black, heavy-leafed branches pulled back like a curtain, and inside a dark chamber of the wood, guarded and made safe. The bed was the bed of all the plants and trees, and we could share it. And then the kneeling down in front of him, keeping my secrets still in the folds of night, trying not to shake in the cold, and the damp floor seeping up. I remember the cold water spreading in the capillaries of my jeans. As I looked up, the sky hidden under a rain of leaves, each tree stood over me in perfect symmetry with his body. Each was like a man with his head bent, each watching and moving and making slow, labored sighs. And I came back often, year on year, kneeling and being knelt for in acts of secret worship. And now each woodland smells quietly of sex, not only when the air is thick with it, but in winter too, when the strains are grounded and held against the earth. And each time I half expect to meet someone among the trees or inside the empty skeleton of the rhododendron. And I wonder if I have ruined these places for myself, if I have brought each secret to them and weighed the trees with things I can no longer bear. But then I think, what is a tree or a plant, if not an act of kneeling to the earth, a way of bidding the water to move, of taking in the mouth the inner part of the world and coaxing it out, not just the aching leaf buds in spring, the cloud of pollen, or in autumn, the children knocking branches for the shower of seed, but the people who kneel in the woods at night, the woman waiting by the gate, offering to each visitor a small portion of the world in which they might work for the life of it. Sticking on this idea of these, I mean, for want of a better word, sexual connections with the natural world. I have a couple of poems in this book that someone once described to me as erotic poems, and I had never thought about them like that. People were kind of reading into some of the poems an erotic undertone, and there are some where this comes through. But I realized what the person who had identified an erotic undertone was really talking about in the poems was an obsession with touch and with scent and with the tactility of something in the natural world. And that struck me, and it made me think about some of the other poems in this book that don't deal with those subjects as well, and how they might be conceived of as erotic or transferring the erotic onto the natural world. This one is a little more clear in that relationship. It's about a tree called Calorie Pear. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They grow all over Manhattan, and they have a very particular smell, which young boys know very well. So this is called Calorie Pear. All of a sudden, it stops me, acrid and sour white, wafting in sheets as the pollen catches the sun, then billows upwards. The same smell, loosing now in drifts through the hot streets, and then, as I breathe, clenching deep under my sacrum, a fist of longing, call of silvered nights when I would make my body burst its bloom, then snug down, half sweated, the stain of myself, smelling almost of another man, held like blossom to my nose. Okay, I'll just read one final poem, which is the one that Hannah mentioned in the introduction. It's called Ilex. This is a poem in which I found myself when I had won the Ginkgo Prize. It apparently switched genders in the poem. The judges, it was submitted anonymously and they assumed it to be a poem by a woman, which is because it includes breastfeeding, and I guess men don't often write about breastfeeding. So I had to add an epigraph now. So it's Ilex after the birth of my nephew. Thank you very much for listening. Ilex. Distracting myself, waiting for news. I walked until I saw this white cluster of holly growing at the base of a tree. The stems yellowed, the angled clutch of leaves like a bleached coral, a pale antler, almost medieval, like a relic unearthing in the gloom of the wood. Later, still the baby would not latch. And I came back to this holly, unhardened by the sun, unable to turn the light into strength. May it keep its whiteness. May it never learn the use of spikes. Or in time, when a crown is made of it, may the people approach one by one to witness how a fragile thing is raised. Thank you very much. Would you like me to share them on the screen, or?
Thanks so much, Seán, for the beautiful reading and for making us witnesses of a world of precious and fragile things. We still have the opportunity to discuss Seán's poetry together, but right now we thought it's best not to have to open the discussion now, but divide into groups where we also Evelyn will send you a link which leads to a Google Sheet with a number of questions. And on that sheet, you will also find 3 of the poems that Seán was just reading. We did not include the Dryad because it's too long. But then we can have a second look at the poems and then also talk about our impressions, speak about atmosphere, what we felt while we were listening to you, and just think about imagery. And we have phrased a number of questions. Maybe it's not necessary to show them on the slide now, so it's pretty clear. And then we'll come back together again. And then have to where we can share our thoughts. The breakout session will last 15 minutes, and then Evelyn will bring you back to the plenary room. Evelyn, would you like to post the link into the chat?
Great, just looking for my unmute button there. So we're not going to go around and ask every single group to say something. It's really just an open invitation to hear from you what came up in your discussions in the groups. And maybe now that we have the opportunity to ask Seán questions, always remembering that the poet isn't necessarily the greatest authority about his own works because they'll outlive him. But now that we have this wonderful chance to ask Seán about what he thinks is going on in these poems, I was really struck by what you said about being surprised that there were erotic readings of them, because one of the things that came up in our group was that we were really struck by this real connectedness between the sexual and the natural in your poems, and that's something that's really striking and really beautiful and that resonates with readers. So yeah, I guess we're just throwing it open, and I'll sit for a bit and say nothing, and then we'll see people's hands go up, or if anyone wants to unmute and just jump in, or maybe Seán wants to say something first. I have a hand that I can see. Kieran Coughlin.
Yeah, it was just, I guess on the evening poem, we were discussing, or I was asking your last line about your teaching as though you're teaching yourself again to bear it. Are you? Some of us thought that it was sort of looking at nature disappearing altogether and having to cope with that. Or was it more just the silence of the night? Have a particular thought in mind when you wrote those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, you know, I'm going to do the classic poet answer and say it's what you want it to be. But I suppose in my mind, as I was writing it, I was thinking about bearing endings of things. So it came out in perhaps just that ambivalent way, where it could be read as the ending of the birds singing. But I think also read in the context of the book, the first narrative arc traces the ending of a relationship. So I think in that case, it opens in a different way. So I suppose that's various contexts that could be read into the poem. But I was definitely thinking about the silence that comes, the kind of terrifying silence, and the idea of having to almost consciously prepare, or feel yourself having to prepare for the oncoming silence or the oncoming ending, was definitely what was on my mind. I think most of the poems would lead me to give that kind of equivocal answer, because most of them, I think in my head, I've fused the natural and the emotional worlds together to such an extent that that I feel it could be about either of them. Yeah.
Beautiful poem. We all love it. Thank you.
I saw a hand, I thought, and now I've lost it again. Did somebody put their hand up? And then Paul Bulger. Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Katrina, and wonderful poems, Seán. Really enjoyed listening to you reading them and reading them again afterwards. And I was in a group with Maura here, and actually on the second reading or third reading of Alex, I was really struck by it. It's a really beautiful poem. But the last stanza where you talk about the witness and fragility in the crown, I suppose we had a question that was that kind of a religious, drawn on religious metaphors, the crown of thorns and the idea of witnessing. Yeah, so that was a kind of, we were reflecting on that.
Yeah, it was. I was thinking, I mean, I'll let you in on a secret, but I think in the back of my head, I was thinking of the Holly and the Ivy, the carol, and that kind of, I love that carol because it has a very medieval imagery running through it, and the idea of the berries as blood and the crown and the thorns. So I think I was kind of attempting to get into that woodland setting through the carol, which brought up that final image. That was another poem in which the poem had originally ended, I think, earlier than that, but I felt it needed a different ending. And yeah, it began, as most of the poems do, with me kind of, I tend to almost as an exercise, just try and closely describe something that has caught my attention. So in this case, this white holly. And then suddenly the line about my nephew came in because I was anxious about that at the time. And the two, again, then began to play off each other. So often it's through that kind of close focus on the natural thing that something else occasionally emerges or intertwines with it. And then it's just the difficulty of tying them both together in the end. Yeah.
We were
Yeah,
really struck.
beautiful.
Oh, sorry, Paul, go on. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, Katrina, that it's it's a really beautiful poem actually, and the idea that we're all fragile and we come from something really fragile, and baby feeding at a breast, and the holly feeding at the base of the tree, and where we forget that fragility as we become adults, and we present this image of strength to the world. But yeah, but really, I think you captured it very nicely in the poem.
Thank you. Thanks.
We were really struck by that one as well, but I think you see another hand. Hannah, is it Hannah?
Yeah, for some reason I can't. Yeah, so that was really, I really think this is such an interesting, poem. It's a great, like these different layers of, it's like a picture puzzle, this fragile thing. And but we were also struck by this bleached coral. If this poem, as we discussed it, is also embracing the fragility of the natural world, also of the human world. But what about this bleached coral, which has almost like a kind of, reading the poem through an eco-critical lens, we cannot help but thinking of the corals that get white because of environmental disaster, because of the warming of the seas. And can you say something about this metaphor and how it relates to this phrase, may it keep its whiteness? It's almost like kind of, leaves me just like, a lot of questions. So can you maybe say something about this image of the bleached coral and how it relates to the fragile things in the poem?
Yeah, I think I was particularly thinking about getting into close detail on what this holly looked like. It looked weak, it looked anemic in a way, it looked like something that had been neglected or damaged, and that is why the bleached coral came into my mind. It also came into my mind through this kind of the spikiness of the form of the holly, I think came through, and also I was trying to get into the heart of what it is when something is either intentionally damaged or neglectfully damaged. And often I think that is through the interactions of strength. And one of the things that I was thinking about particularly in this poem was masculinity and the destructive potential of forcing something to be strong, or of well, how that can damage both the child, the young boy, and the natural world. So I link the two of them together in that way. I think the whiteness in the end is not related to the coral, but to the holly.
Sive O'Neill.
Yeah, thanks, John. I loved the poems too, and I was really struck by the last one. And just while you were talking there about this kind of nativity scene almost, I was just struck by the lovely sense of sort of balance between the feminine and the masculine, because there's the breastfeeding image there, the baby, nuzzling its mum, or his mum, it's your nephew, but you're sort of patrolling, doing that kind of guardian role, which is so beautiful, and it's so important. I mean, for those of us who've been there, that kind of nurturing role is what keeps the thorns at bay. And breastfeeding can be like thorns. So I just love that balance, actually, and it's so difficult to get that across, in poetry. You did it beautifully.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I don't think I had meant to write a breastfeeding poem, but it was, I suppose, a lot of them, a lot of the time, anxieties emerge when you are writing something that you don't think is about the thing that you're anxious about. And I was at the time anxious about my nephew. I was very young at the time. So yeah, I think, you know, one of the things I like about that poem in particular is that it suggests almost that the I of the poem could be a genderless space, in that when I write the poem, or when I am I in the poem, I'm not, I could be taken to be a man or a woman. I could exist outside of those things, and I think that's a kind of a rare thing inside a piece of written work, because obviously when I read it, you know, it's me, and you take signals from it, but disembodied, taken out of context, I think it's nice to have little portals in which that is possible, and I think poems can be those little portals, which I like.
I was really struck by the anecdote about the jury, Seán, that they assumed it was a poem by a female poet, and that possibility that literature offers us a space beyond, not always, but that it can do, that it can offer us that space where we wouldn't have to declare, where everything could move into some kind of non-binary space, and then we come back to our lives in which we're confronted again by these systems that can be so painful and so destructive. And I wanted to ask you about the longer poem, which we don't have on the sheet, but I wrote down as you were reading it so beautifully, and to connect it up with that image of the prickles, may it never learn its use of spikes, that some fear, at least it came up in our breakout room, around violence and around a destructive kind of potentially masculinity. And in the other poem, even though these document these very intimate sensual encounters between men, and yet at the other hand there's that sudden moment of anxiety. I pretended to be a man like him. I think I was afraid all the time he would kill me, and that there's a huge risk and danger involved in opening ourselves to intimacy with another person, particularly in an isolated space. And yet the poems are really charged also by a kind of excitement around that. So I don't really have a question so much. I just wanted to say how that really resonated, you know, that this whole complex around gender and sexuality is in this woodland area, and it has a charge of danger to it, but it also has a sense of possibility and excitement. And does that, you know, is that, and then that wonderful moment where you're afraid you've ruined the woods, not you, obviously it's the lyric I, isn't it? But that there's, I wonder if I have ruined these places for myself, which when we're standing here against the horizon of ecocidal damage to our planetary home, the notion of ruining our own places for ourselves takes on this very wide resonance too. And I wonder if that's something that came in more biographically from your own experiences, or did you have that horizon with it?
I suppose, yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. One of the things that I think the ending of that poem, the ruining part, comes from, trying to sound like I'm full of anxieties, but it comes from a sort of concern about ornamentation and symbolism, and me attaching biographical, emotional weight to trees. Have I if I have weighed the trees with things I can no longer bear, I think is the line. Have I in my head invented a landscape that is not the landscape in front of me, and should I be doing that? And then trying to toe the line between that and some the consolation that might be in a landscape, or a new way of seeing what the landscape can teach you. I think that was one of the knots that I was trying to work out there, and I do quite often through the book is try to measure my own presence in the landscape and the aesthetic tendency as against the thing for the thing itself. I think that's what I was trying to get around there. And in terms of the this idea of danger, it is something that comes up a lot and has come up in conversations I've had elsewhere with fellow poets. Because someone once said to me, as a joke, God, you must spend a lot of time walking around at night, because a lot of my poems are kind of me walking around at night. And how that isn't possible for half the population or more. And so there is not only the danger inherent in me doing it. This poem was looking at how we kind of see these public or natural spaces as sites of non-normative sexualities. But there's also the inherent reverse side of this, which is that my lyric eye can do this, and other people's lyric eyes are limited by what those public spaces mean, or what after dark in a woodland means. And that is something that I suppose I'm thinking about more after I'd written this book. There's a great poet called Helen Tukey. Now, I had written a poem in this book called Adoration, which is about this fungus. And I was out for a walk and I sent Helen a photo of this fungus. And she wrote a poem about me texting her about the fungus, about her wishing she could also be walking at night in an empty space. And I think that poem and Helen's poem read together make a really good case study kind of the freedoms and desires of the eco poet or the poet in the natural world in a gendered way. It's published in Tentacular magazine. I'll try and find you the link for Helen's poem, and send it to you. It's great.
Thank you. That's marvelous also to kind of think about, because one of the purposes of this series with Friends of the Earth has to be to try and connect up questions around social justice with the ecological questions that we're exploring, and that's a really marvelous example of that. So who has access to the woods at night, and what does that mean, and how is it different for different people? I see there's a question for Niall from Niall O'Luby, and perhaps we could take that question and then we'll move straight on to the next program point, because I'm aware of time ticking. Niall.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's just, just you mentioned at the beginning sort of poets that you may have read. It just occurred to me that Walt Whitman might be one that you had taken some inspiration from in his Leaves of Grass.
Yeah, Walt Whitman and Mark Doty. I don't know if you know Mark Doty, the American poet, who I suppose probably takes some from Whitman too. But I think it's a rare enough thing in the Whitman is a good example, a good early example and a key example, but I think it's a rare enough thing for the queer poet to be also the pastoral poet. I think we often think of cities and built environments as spaces of that sort of freedom. So yeah, I suppose looking for models backwards is less easy in that way. You know, you have the Frank O'Haras and you have the poets of the city, but who do you have? It's the poet of the pastoral. Whitman is a good example. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Seán, and I'm sure there will be more questions for Seán, and I hope that you can stay with us for the second hour. But now it's my pleasure to hand back to Evelyn, who's going to introduce our next special guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seán and Katrina, and everyone for your questions. And Anna has a really interesting comment in the chat there. So please, everyone, feel free to keep using the chat. But now we're going to move on to a different medium, to a visual art. And we're delighted to welcome activist Alex Wernke from the Klimakollektiv, who tackled the climate crisis using creative tools. And Alex has a huge wealth of experience and knowledge from actively campaigning against coal mining in the Rhineland and working with the Alle Dörfer Bleiben Alliance, who organise against forced displacement for mining. And Alex is going to share with us graphic-based storytelling as a power tool for grassroots movement education, and to show up some close-up imagery from the Rooted in Resistance project. And that's a project which draws attention to the injustices faced, but also it pictures and it inspires a better future within that same image. So Katrina will facilitate questions after the presentation, but feel free to continue typing in the chat for the moment. And now I'll hand over to Alex. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, so thanks so much for your introduction for the first part with Seán, and yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and the chance to present our work. I was invited tonight for sharing our experiences with graphic-based storytelling, whatever you imagine, we see afterwards. As English is not my mother tongue, let's say, sorry for maybe some creative moments of using the language. I'm going to take you on a kind of, we're going to travel through this graphic for about 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to have a short presentation for you, and now we move away from the poems, the poetry, to graphics and pictures. Yeah, and I'm going to share my screen with you. So this is not the beginning. Yeah, I'm going to take you on a journey through this graphic campaign, Rooted in Resistance, we designed 4 years ago. This is it, and we're going to dive in this graphic soon. Let's Rooted in Resistance graphic, and I'm going to take you to where it comes from, which stories are in there, and how we try to make kind of social movement education with it, which gonna motivate people to take action. Yeah, so for getting started, this is me. This is about 12 years ago. So I just finished school, I think, and I was like, cool, what the fuck? I had no clue what coal mining is, and that's an issue. And now I'm gonna take you a little bit more closer to the graphic, as the graphic starts telling the story of Hambach Forest, which is a huge forest in Germany, which had been a huge forest between Cologne and Aachen in the very west of Germany, and which is a very magical place. And I got the chance to see that forest in 2012 the first time, like 10 years ago. And it's a place full of legends. It's a place full of stories about tragedy, but also a victory of, there's a very famous legend about a singer-songwriter, you would say today, who fought the king in a battle and who won the forest for the people. And for thousands of years, they would care for it. And so it was possible that such a precious ecosystem could form with a lot of rare species. But it's also very, very special because it's on top of billions and billions of tons of lignite coal. So since the late 70s, it got cut every year from around 5,500 hectares to 200 left. And yeah, it's all about lignite coal, and lignite is not something people would say, wow, let me hear that fantastic, interesting story about. But actually, lignite is very special, and it's fascinating how this very unique thing formed millions of years ago, and in a very, very unique conditions. At some places on Earth, coal was formed out of, sun energy, out of plants. So normally I would have in workshops, I would have like a piece of lignite coal and share it with people and get a connection to this very special resource, part of Earth. And this is where we start where we root our rooted in resistance graphic. If you need some orientation, I put a map on top. So this is Germany, and in the very west, close to the Netherlands and close to Belgium, there is the Hambach Forest, the very rest of it. And what you can see here, it's the hugest lignite mine in the world, the Hambach Mine, and it's about 450 meters deep, and it's huge and it's impressive. So in the core of our graphic, you would find this huge mine together with the big excavators, eating their way through the landscape. We're going to come back soon. The village on the left side you see here is vanishing in the memories. And on top, you see the huge power plants where all the coal is going, and where you can see dooming. In reality, this is how the big mines look like. And when I was there the first time, I felt like, wow, this is Mordor, like at a lot of the Rings. And what's the good thing about Mordor is that it's a good starting point to tell a story. So Mordor is where the evil, the bad, is at its core. And I think when I started 2012 to think about how can we tell that story to people, how can we share what we experienced here, this was the very starting point, that this is impressive. This is the hugest machines in the world, and they are made for destruction. And this is happening right in the center of Europe. And when I came back from the first visit at Humber Forest 2012, I got in contact with a lot of people, and together with friends, we formed two groups, two collectives. The one is the Klimakollektiv, which is an educational collective to share experiences out of social movements, the climate movement, and to people from the movement form people in the movement. And Ausgekohlt, which is a Rhineland-based group, like the region here, who formed 2011 to end coal here. And we are almost done, I would say, after 10 years. And 2012 was also the time when we got in contact, like all these beautiful people you see here, with the graphics of the Beehive Design Collective. The Beehive Design Collective is a US-based collective from artists, educators, campaigners, designers, who made a lot of impressive graphics on complex issues like genetic engineering or free trade, and also on coal mining. So that was the big impression, and I want to give some credits to them. And the core questions we were facing was, the one thing was, how do we tell our stories? How do we tell our stories which form the version of the world like we see it, like our viewpoint on power dynamics, on injustice, how we want to have the world in, like, for example, different nature connection, or how it is connected, all the struggle in the Rhineland to colonialism and capitalism. So how do we show the bigger picture? And the second thing was, we wanted to inspire for action. We wanted to build a social movement education to share our experiences, but also to inspire people that they learn how we can win as a social movement, that social movements can make a change. And I think this is a very important point, because social movements are those who are forgotten, and who are mostly those who have made things successful. So we started 2018, at the very beginning, January 2018, to design that graphic, and we wanted to make this graphic about how the climate movement in Germany, with the Humber Forest at its core, was growing and escalating the struggle. And it was designed as something as a consolation for the movement in the moment when we lost the forest. But at the end, it showed that it was about the biggest success story we had. So I brought you some impressions that you learn what was happening then and how that stories looked like. We tried to transform into graphics. Though in 2018, there was a huge treehouse villages in this forest between Cologne and Aachen, and this forest was supposed to be completely cut for the lignite mine. And there were people living kind of in a very alternative way inside the trees, inside the forest. And by living there, they were blocking the mining activities. So it was beautiful houses and beautiful people, beautiful trees too. And at the beginning of, like, it was a Thursday, 13th of December, when there were thousands of policemen and big machines entering the forest. But the weeks afterwards were those which told the story how normal people could fight back a big company and how they could win peacefully the forest. So at the very left on the top, you see Christians standing in the way when the first machines entered the forest. And for me, that was a very strong story. And I thought about how can we tell this to others, that normal people take action. Like people on the right who were young people from all over Germany, all over Europe, traveling to the forest, entering the mine, and entering the forest in the morning and trying to block the big machines. Thousands of people joining big demonstrations. And of course, there was not a kind of, we could not win this fight militarily. So police and security forces, they would take over the forest step by step, destroy the houses, destroy the structures. But people in thousands peacefully fought back. And while they were destroying one house, people would build up another on the other side of the forest. At the end of the 3 weeks, the forest was completely cleared. But 3 days later, a court ruled that the forest was protected for the next month before there was a final decision on a rare species. And 1 day later, 50,000 people took back the forest and they reoccupied it. And it is still occupied. So this picture is actually, at the end, it was a story. It is a big graphic story about how, as a social movement, we won that fight about a forest. And when this graphic was published, it was this big demonstration. And for me and for our collective, the last years, we took the chance to use the graphic as, to inspire people and to connect different topics and also struggles. For example, the struggle about Hambach Forest also inspired on another mine more north, inspired people, villagers, to defend their villages. Because as the Hambach Forest was safe, the politicians and the company said, well, you can have the forest, but then we need the villages because we need the coal below. And actually last year in December, when the new coalition formed on the national level, the new government, we made it to save the villages in the new government. And there was so many different actions the last years, like people taking over the streets, this yellow cross, this yellow X, which is the symbol of people resisting in the villages in the region. There were even church services on mining area. There were big climate camps and broad coalitions, people coming together to share their experiences. So this is the kind of, in German, I would say the ground layer, the ecosystem of stories where we try to create this graphic from. And how did we do it? We went to people at the beginning 2018 and shared the graphics from the Beehive Design Collective, collective and graphics we did before and said, well, we want to translate your stories. We are interested in what is your daily experiences? What is your experiences with coal mining, with the company, with the destruction of your village, but also the normal stories about how do people live traditions. And we collected all those stories and brought it back. We discussed about parallels, about the bigger picture, about interconnections. And what you see on the top right is my kind of first mind mapping when we were thinking about how could we design that graphic. And we found a drawer, a comic guy from Cologne, who is actually a carpenter, but he's also making comics. And together, about 9 months long, we discussed, we feedbacked, we had drafts, and you see on the lower right how intense this process was. And Oliver, the guy who drew the picture, almost went mad, but he made it. And as a group of, I think we were 5 to 10 people in the core group, but there was hundreds of stories involved and hundreds of people. It took us 9 months to create this graphic. And I want to take you for some minutes into the graphic to show you how we worked, and maybe also what are the characteristics. So the question is, why did we use animal characters? What is the advantage of using animal characters to tell the stories which were told by humans? And also, what makes it difficult to draw and tell those stories which are told by humans? So give me a minute. I will share the online tool. So you're back. So this is an online tool we designed where you can discover this graphic in the digital space. And I just, maybe you just let me know, what are your thoughts why using animals is such a strong choice?
Because of the fables?
Of course. There's animals we know in different regions and different traditions and different stories which have special characters, like the owl and the fox. And when we think about it, at least in my regions in Germany, we think about, wow, they have a kind of wisdom, they are clever. And that's exactly what they stand for. In this case, for the legal support for activists and people who are affected by repression of the police and the state. One of the main reasons why we chose animals to tell those stories is, if you think about telling human stories, you would have to decide which age, which gender, which skin, which are people black or are they white? And you would probably tend to reproduce stereotypes and discrimination. So this was one main reason why we decided it's easier to use animal characters. What else comes in your mind? I think I have 5 minutes left, right? That's great.
What are the gold dots for?
What's it?
The gold dots. On the graphic, there is gold dots. Yeah. Are you supposed to click on them?
Yeah, you can click on them, and then there will be some things popping up. I can show you later. Yeah. Okay. So this is kind of interactive. When we think about the consequences of climate crisis or of lignite coal mining, the last years we thought that people who are living in the villages, who are affected in the region, can make their voices heard. But the most affected species are those who are non-human. That's animals and plants. So we decided to show animals and plants who are living in that region
to in somehow to make their voices heard, to show how diverse that ecosystems are and how many living beings are there. One important point is also that using animal characters is not only about fables and tales, but and their like what characteristic they have in there, but also, for example, you will find here this very this snail, which is with their physical physically it's slower than others, and that's, for example, in this case for the slow change. So we have to be very patient and keep on. All these animals who live there, who are shown in that graphic, are based in the region. So we show how we bring the stories back home, and we try to show this diversity. What you will also find in this graphic is that it's in a way from the bottom to the top. It's there are different worlds, there are different world views colliding. So we have this grassroots perspective on the bottom, and this very global and top-down thing with the power holders here. We have this very technical and destructive way of living and production. We have this organic growing, which is very different to this linear system thinking, this growth model we live in this capitalist society. And this growth model is very different. It's organic, and it also, when you were to look in the middle here, the trees are changing somehow. There's like a organic change to activists. And one last thing is we try to think not linear, also not only in the way of growth, but also in the way of time. So in the nature, in society, we are organized in a very linear way. We think in a very linear way, but nature is not functioning. Time in nature is not functioning in a linear way. It's organized in cycles, and we try to tell the stories in a more cycle way. So this idea of circles of life, circles of the day, or seasons. And from the left to the right, you will have, like, from spring to winter, the different seasons of the year. Okay, the last 2 minutes I will share the other screen again. So it's important to think about how we tell stories, how we design the graphics is, for example, on the right, the first draws, the first draft were very male. It's very, classic, I would say. And we changed that. It's more inclusive. On the left, you have this bad guy, the responsible minister for the destruction of the forest. And we changed that because, we need to get rid of this very polarized views. And if you design a graphic, especially a comic thing, you will tend to use very polarized graphics. One of my favorite stories in the picture is this big pumpkin. And the pumpkin, for me, is not only connected with a personal story of this great, great lady who, since the 80s, organized demonstration and who brought all these great people from everywhere to the mine. Gisela Irving. She's Scottish, by the way, Irving. But she also gave to the Klima campers and the activists coming every year the fruits of her garden. So this pumpkin symbol for me is a symbol of feeding this growing system of self-growing in the small-scale farming, but also a different attitude to nature. So she grows this movement, but also a different connection to nature, which is she is this pumpkin in the graphic. And the last thing is I put up some principles we work with, and maybe we can discuss about that. the last thing is I'm going to tell you is we try to produce art for public space. We're not interested in putting up this art in some museums and there's only a limited access, people have to pay for it, or it's like not interactive. We want to invite people to interact with that. We want to change it. We want people to cut it. We want it to paint it like we did in the workshops. And one core thing is we want to make those unheard voices heard. And it's also about that people are empowered to tell their own stories connected to the graphics. So we don't have this graphics organized that only some people can tell their stories, which are originally meant, but it's also new stories that can be connected to the graphics. So kind of a popular education, people can educate themselves together with the graphics and others, meets social movement education as it is about social movement struggles. And the one thing, like two big things are, we want not only tell an environmental view, it's about telling this power view, that we have grassroots power which confronts the top-down power of government, the top-down power of state, and it can change it. And it connects the environmental issue to the bigger picture of social justice. And we produce the graphics with a Creative Commons license, so people can use it, distribute it, change it. And that's how the work with the graphic looks like. So we try to bring it to people, to young people, to elders, to festivals, to demonstrations, and yeah, let people share their stories, but also share the stories of those who told us their stories, so they will be not forgotten. Yeah, so that would be what I wanted to share with you, and maybe there's some questions and inspiration on it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex, for this really fascinating insight into the world. And there's also, I would like to read the comment from Miriam Mune, fantastic graphics of the animals and plants, and it gives you so much food to think about and to discuss. That's really very inspiring. I also feel particularly touched by your presentation because I myself grew up in Essen, which is part of the Rhineland region, and so I can relate to the stories and your concerns very well. I would like to, we have a few, like maybe 3 minutes to ask questions, to put the questions to Alex before we then move on to the broader discussion. Any questions, comments relating to Alex's presentation, please feel free to speak, raise your hands. So there is Aiden, please. Aiden Ring, yeah. And then after that, Anne.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Really interesting approach to focus on the graphic thing. Must have taken ages to create, but it's very beautiful. So my whole thing is like, I am in that same situation where a place that's very kind of, you know, biologically and culturally valuable is being threatened. And so it seems that you, through this project, engaged with a lot of amazing people and created a movement. So this is kind of just like were you surprised at the volume of interest and the amount of people who showed up, like 50,000 for a protest? And I don't know, what would you attribute that sort of strength of response to? If you had any tips or advice on how you can create that kind of tipping point, level of interest, critical mass, then that would be super interesting.
Yeah, difficult question. I think this, but which is very important to understand, is that this Humber Forest thing was, in my, like a metaphor would be like glowing, and it was in the grassroots and not coming up, and it was under the surface. So in 2017, 18, there was this hot summer. There was a very aggressive government and police attacking the forest, and so it was, and also a lot of NGOs and grassroots groups joining, and that gave the tipping point of attention, and by a lot of pictures and a very, very good public strategy of sharing stories, faces, people telling what is happening there, and very peacefully, but very committed, living in that forest. And as the eviction took 2.5 or 3 weeks, there was a lot of moments and a lot of media coverage in these weeks. I think that made it possible that so many people joined in. But it was only after 6 years struggling. So in these 6 years, we had a lot of lonely moments. So I think, yeah, it's a lot of networking, a lot of grassroots campaigning, and then you can hope for these opportunity moments. Yeah.
Anne, hospital.
Thank you very much, first of all, for introducing us to the graphic and also for analyzing that. I think that gave a good, maybe it mirrors really the protest and the movement, the further picture you gave while analyzing the graphic. I am a teacher in Ireland, and I have discussed this as part of a novel with the course as well. And I would be really interested in getting access, if at all possible, to this graphic. Would it be possible, or would you be willing to share a link, if possible, of the website? Or this would be great, and I would like to include it into my teaching if possible.
Yeah, thanks. We would be super happy if this is, we would say, cross-pollinating the grassroots, or somehow spreading, and you can just use it. It's open source, and the only thing is that probably we have to check if it's how accessible it is, because it's mainly German, the materials we have on the website. But yeah, maybe there's a way to deal with it. Yeah, definitely. We can, maybe Evelyn or someone can get us in contact. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think there'll be an opportunity at the end of this session for links to be shared in the chat and so on. But if not, maybe Anna can follow up with one of us afterwards. Great.
Thank you.
Miriam Mooney, I think you had your hand up as well. And then Barbara, did I see that correctly, Miriam?
Yeah, I've pulled back, so let's someone else go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think it's Barbara. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thanks very much for this. Really enjoyed it. And my question would be, you talked about translation, and it's basically the translation of the text into the graphics. And in a way, you said you translate complex stories and make them accessible for the wider audience. Can you tell a bit more about that process? How do you think that translation? How is that going on in your mind? How do you translate it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's stories which also people already connect places to, or in my mind there pops up a symbol or something. But there's also, in this group discussions, we had moments when it became obvious that some stories are around the same issue. So you would look for a symbol which would show that, or an animal, for example, which is connected to a special habit or a special place. A character rises, for example, a bird which characterizes maybe a special place to live, but also you connect some feelings of freedom to it, or for example, so there's ideas coming up, we discuss about it, and maybe then we would share our ideas with those persons who told their stories, and they would say, well, the butterfly is definitely not the right character for it. So that's one way. And yeah, the translation is also, we would also let the like Oliver, the comic person, create drafts. So we have a foundation to discuss on. And when he was drawing the first policeman, it became obvious that we didn't want to have very male-ish stereotype police guys with who looked very evil. So we discussed what kind of idea do we have about police as a institution which acts as an institution, but mainly not as a person. So we would kind of depersonalize them. In the case of the pumpkin, for example, for me, it was very clear that is a symbol of the story of her. And then I talked to Gisela, and she was like, yeah, that totally fits for me. The fox and the owl, for example, are two friends of mine. And one of them, she characterizes herself as an owl because she wears glasses, and she also has this wisdom. These are very long, this movement. So at some part it was easy, and that was self-chosen. At some point it was hard, and there's also some parts which are not so easy because they are about, for example, activists in the Pacific, and then we don't want to use cliches, and they should choose a symbol of their own. Very often it was just their choice how they wanted to be told. Mm-hmm. And there was one last thing, but I don't think we have time. Right?
Thanks so much. So maybe was there a last question? Otherwise, we would maybe move on to the final part. I can't see a hand. Great. So thanks so much again, Alex. And I would like to open the discussion now to a broader context. You've already spoken about this, Alex, but also this kind of the relationship between art and action, thinking, reflecting, and doing. And something that we can take away today is that there is certainly no straightforward conclusion, and that art doesn't necessarily explicitly tell us what to do. So with your project, Alex, there is a clear intent, also an educational framing. You explain the art project and also give guiding principles. And with Seán's poetry, it's a different approach. It's a very explorative dialogue with nature. It is part of the interpretive process to understand the ecological urgency in it. And maybe I just start with you, Seán. So how do you see this relationship between art and action? Are forms of action important to your own creative process, or is it maybe you can say something about that, also what have brought you to write about environmental issues, and is it a conscious process or more something that is more like a kind of subconsciously done?
I mean, I think that art has many functions, and I think it can do both at once. I don't think I would ever pretend that my poems are intended as educational or consciousness raising texts. I suppose I see the poem more as an experience for the reader, in a way that I don't want to be in the way of. I want to kind of create a vehicle in which a reader can experience a certain thing. And the best value I think I could get out of one of my poems would be able to situate a person closely in a moment of close looking and interaction with the natural world, and leave them there, and leave them to be in that moment, to provide kind of a way, an access window in that way. And I would, in my personal practice, I wouldn't want to then tell them what to make of that, because I feel like that would break a sort of contract between me and the reader, where I become teacher or I become imparter of knowledge, rather than the guide, I suppose, in some ways. But I think that there are all different ways of doing this, and there are poets that are much more clearly, I think, engaged with the activism elements of what we might call eco-poetry than I am. In the text itself, I mean, that there are texts that might engage more strongly with that. I think my personal practice is more affective than it is directive or designed with intent, a sort of real world intent, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
What's really interesting there actually is thinking about the various different ways in which art can open up access, and it could be access on all sorts of levels. I mean, at the very practical level, Alex, when you were talking about blocking access of the machines, you know, with the actual physical bodies of the protesters standing in a line so that the machines don't come into the forest, and that's in order to be able to guarantee access for future generations into that space of the forest, both the physical and then with all of its richness and magic and stories that come alive through the art. So there's something in there that connects both very, very different approaches, one of which is engaged, we could say, or committed to an activist model, and then another which is maybe more reflective in a sense of stepping back from any direction to a reader, and yet both of them are enabling access in different ways to experience that we are being robbed of through the destructive tendencies of the capitalist ecocidal model that is touched on throughout the discussion tonight. So I'm really struck by this question of access, because it brings in the questions of social justice that came up in the earlier discussion as well. And it sounds and looks from what you were reporting, Alex, from that whole decade-long experience, that these were questions that you were grappling with as a collective as well, questions around access and social justice. Are there other questions coming up there in the chat, or I'm just going to throw that out there?
Sure, maybe one last question for me. Do you feel that writing about nature has changed your relationship or the way you think about nature? Is it maybe the other way around, that do you go out into nature in order to write about it, or is it more all through imagination? What role does experience play for you? And has it also this kind of, is writing about nature, does it change your relationship, your thinking or experiencing it? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think you know, this is probably the one point at which my practice does come into a sort of consciousness raising thing, is that I do a lot of workshops, and most of the time those workshops are based around what I call kind of forms of close looking, which can be these almost opening up a space of attention on certain things in the natural world. And that's usually my own practice. So the workshops are kind of modeled on that. So I usually ask people to bring in, you know, we do kind of use ambient noise, watch videos of certain landscapes. We read scientific articles, and we kind of build all of these things into the scope of the poem. And that's usually how I work too. Now, I tend to begin with that kind of close attention, and focusing that close attention of people onto the specifics of the world around us, I think is an act of getting people to stop and actually think about the things that are there, and the specifics of what a tree is, and that they're not all the same tree even, and just to think about how a leaf looks when it's growing, and to play them kind of time-lapse videos and just get them to focus in on it. I think kind of opens up a space for, I suppose for want of a better word, kind of wonder at the world around you. And I think one of the things that causes me a lot of anxiety is the depletion of that wonder that we might have in the world around us, and the depletion for the capacity for that wonder as things are destroyed. So to hold attention on that process and to show the importance of it. I think is one of the main principles behind how I work, and it struck me that Alex's use of fable and mythology and art in that way is also reconnecting a kind of primal human wonder and joy in the natural world, and then turning that to effective ends. I think recovering that is something really important in what art's offering to fighting the climate crisis with just that mode of close attention is what art is good at.
Yeah. I'm just keenly aware of time ticking up towards the hour. The really important point in there coming through in Alex's graphic as well about the power of anthropomorphism, which is when we imbue animals with human characteristics. And for a long time, this was seen as something kind of problematic. That's humans imposing ourselves on the world again. But actually, we can use those animal fables and animal figures in all sorts of creative and empowering ways in this space. So I'm aware that Barbara also has another question. Maybe Barbara, if you could type it into the chat, because it's time for me and Hannah to hand back over to Friends of the Earth, who have been our hosts and companions on this wonderful journey around speaking the predicament. So I'll hand back to Evelyn now, who will have information about the next events in the Learning Hub, and then we'll have a chance to say thank you to our special guests again at the end. Thanks, Evelyn.
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly inspiring. Even just in those last 2 minutes, I was thinking about how many of the major players in the Irish Revolution were poets and used imagery of Irish nature and things that we've been sadly losing, but also fighting to protect at the same time. Even I was thinking Patrick Pearse, supposedly in his last night in his cell before execution, wrote about images of fields in Connacht and things like that, and little towns in Connacht. Yes, you've got the cook there. Yes, little rabbits in a field at evening lit by a slanting sun. One of the last lines he wrote. So these really do connect to our history of resistance here in Ireland, but also resistance internationally, as we saw from Alex's work. So thank you so much for that. Now, I'd like to briefly turn the tables and ask a question, not to our amazing speakers, but to our amazing participants tonight. I'm going to ask you a question here, which is, do you think poetry and visual arts can increase your ability to critically assess what is happening in our society and the wider world, and increase your understanding of root causes of inequalities? Now, this wouldn't be the same for everyone. Some people learn through different means. Some people prefer to read statistics and papers, but I'm wondering how many of you find that poetry and visual arts does this for you. So I'll give you a moment to answer the questions. I know not everyone is on a device that can see the polls, so I will include a link to this question at the end if you want to share your thoughts and ideas. Okay, and it looks like most people are in agreement. Just 6% said somewhat. They think that this is a way to critically assess and learn, but 94% said yes, that this is a way that they critically assess and learn. And definitely based on the comments in the chat, but also the chats we were having in the breakout rooms and here in the main session. I think it was Deirdre was telling me about the Irish Writers Centre Climate Writing Group, which is another one of these ways that we learn from these creative tools, but at the same time, the artists themselves has a way to reflect upon an otherwise, major and hard to grasp crisis. So thank you so much. There's been so many times during this night that I've gotten chills, not just from the drafts in my house, but from the somewhat worrying but also hopeful stories. Now, I'd like to just briefly mention some of the actions we have, because I know some people want to move into action straight away, which you probably felt very inspired by some of the protest imagery shared there. And I do want everyone to take to the streets when they can, but if you can't, I'm going to share our Solar Schools petition here, that one of the ways that we're tackling moving away from fossil fuels is Friends of the Earth has a petition to progress our policies to allow solar panels be put on schools without a really slowed down planning process. So if you can sign that petition, if you haven't done that already. We're also coming up to International Women's Day soon enough, and we at Friends of the Earth will be joining a rally outside the Dáil in 2 weeks on Saturday the 5th of March, and it's organised by the National Women's Council, and it would be great to see some of your faces there if you're able to come. So I'll share a link to that rally and more information about it in the chat here. But also I'll share that next week we're doing 2 webinars on the topic of gender justice. So if you can't make it to the rally in Dublin, you can join online to those gender justice webinars. If you want to get active in your own area, if you want to start your own protests, or you have ideas from campaigns and you're looking for a group to take action with, you can join your local One Future groups if you haven't already. So these are constituency based, so there's several of them around the country. If you do feel isolated and you want to connect with some local environmental activists, there's a link for that there. Now, our next Learning Hub sessions in March are going to change topic. We're going to be looking at energy poverty. On the 7th of March, we're going to have a webinar on energy poverty. And then on the 21st, we're going to have a workshop about retrofitting, which as anyone here knows, that we have lots of changes going on in Ireland regarding retrofitting. And of course, around the world, we're feeling the issues revolving around energy prices. So if you'd like to give any feedback about tonight, I'd really appreciate feedback, because last time we immediately looked at your feedback and built it into this session. So it really helps us to improve these sessions, but it also helps us reach our requirements. So there's a 2-minute well, it's a 2.5-minute feedback form, but it won't take too long. If you can give some of your thoughts about what you liked about tonight, what you didn't like about tonight, what you found inspiring, what ideas it brought to mind. And thank you so much. Thank you to Hannah and Katrina for facilitating. Thank you so much to Seán for reading your poems and inspiring us. And thank you so much to Alex for showing us those images of the activism you've done over the years and different tools that we can use for our campaigns here. So thank you very much, and I'm going to stop the recording now.